Hey there, knitters. Welcome to episode 35 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. And boy, oh boy, has fall come in like a lion. Just last week, I was down in sunny California in t-shirts and sunscreen, and now I'm all wrapped up, ready for winter. And I feel like you can even see it on the video. Like the lighting is just so different now that the sun is gone. I hope wherever you are, that if you are into fall, that you're enjoying the fall season rolling in. I know I certainly am. I'm always happiest in a sweater and scarves. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at today's topic. And we are finally going to be talking about yarn substitutions. There's a lot of conversation about yarn substitutions, especially because fall is here and we're knitting sweaters. So today I'm going to share with you 3 of my favorite methods for looking at substitutions and then give you some practical examples so hopefully you can roll it into making substitutions on your own. So if I'm at home and looking at patterns on Ravelry, or maybe already bought a pattern, and I'm looking for yarn substitutions, the first thing I do is go back to that pattern page right on Ravelry. Let's take a look at my Amazing Woman Shawl pattern page, just as an example. In 2 places, I reference the yarn I use. The first is in the upper portion where I reference the sizes available, which is circled in purple. There's a size available in fingering weight yarn and a size available in DK weight yarn. So right off the bat, we can see that we're going to be wanting to look for either fingering or DK weight yarn for substitutions. Below, in the red circle, I also name the specific yarns that I've used. Obviously, we can't see the whole screen here, but we can see some more specific details about the yarn, like the fiber content and the yardage per skein. So, with that information, the first thing I do, before you look at any yarn details too much, I go to the Yarn Ideas tab. This can be found at the top of the page, roughly centered. I've circled it in red with a big arrow for you. Now that we're in the Yarn Ideas tab, we can see that both fingering weight yarns and DK weight yarns are listed because the 2 size options in the pattern offer both of those weights. Let's say you want to make a DK weight shawl. You can click on the Barnyard Knits DK listing, which you see has a used 1 time below it in blue. And when you click on it, you'll automatically see all of the project have used that specific yarn and what it might look like. So since my shawl is fairly humble in the number of people that have knit it or at least posted the yarns that they've used, let's take a look at a more popular project and see what you can do with the power of that Yarn Ideas tab. This is the Shift Cowl pattern by Andrea Mowry. This original pattern calls for a lovely color fading yarn to get a blended look across the project. 3 different colors are used throughout the project. And the yarn that is called for is a really lovely yarn, but it's not necessarily the most economical option out there. So if we click again on that Yarn Ideas tab, noting that we have almost 13,000 projects available to us, we can see that we have a huge number of yarn options presented that have been used specifically for this pattern. Now let's take a look at the Malabrigo yarn. This is not only a more affordable option for those who need to consider budget, but also a non-color fading yarn. It's a solid color yarn. So by clicking on this option, which has been used 207 times, we can see all of the projects that have used this yarn. It can give you an idea of how the project will look when using not only a different brand of yarn, but also a different style of yarn, a solid yarn versus a blend of color fading yarn. So before we go any further with this, I just want to take a moment and talk really briefly about knitters asking for substitutions on yarns directly to the designer. So when a designer, not always, but very often, knits a new design and lists a specific yarn, it's because they have a collaboration with a particular yarn company or dye house. So the relationship between the designer and the yarn company is meant to be mutually beneficial. The yarn company will very often give the yarn to the designer either for free or at a discounted price to use in their design, and the benefit comes back to the yarn company in the referral, to use a lack of a better term, of the yarn in the designer's pattern. The hope, of course, is that the knitter will see the pattern, love the pattern, and choose the yarn exactly that's listed in the pattern. And that's why the relationship is mutually beneficial. The designer doesn't pay for the yarn, or maybe doesn't pay full price for the yarn, and the yarn company gets the benefit of the referral. So when a knitter emails a designer and asks for yarn substitutions, whether it's for budget reasons or for fiber content reasons, it can be a little bit tricky to refer them to another company because of that intended mutually beneficial relationship. I sort of think about it like if you are at a fast food restaurant, like let's just say McDonald's. Let's say you're at McDonald's and you can see all of their offerings on the menu and you decide that you want the Big Mac meal. And so that Big Mac meal is a yarn pattern. The components of it, a Big Mac, fries, and a Coke, are kind of like the yarn suggestions, right? They're telling you that this is how they make their kit of their meal. You wouldn't go into a McDonald's and ask for a Big Mac meal and hope for the cheeseburger and the Coke and then ask for a recommendation for somewhere else to get fries, right? It's not beneficial for McDonald's to send folks down the road to Wendy's, I don't know, to get French fries. So obviously that is a very simplified version of it, but it's a good way to sort of think about when a designer suggests a specific yarn, it's because it's to help them to some extent because they received the yarn, but it also helps the yarn companies. So if you get resistance or not a particularly specific response from a designer when you ask for a substitution, it's likely because they are honoring the relationship they have with that yarn company. I suppose it's also really important for me to acknowledge the fact that French fries, to use that example, whether you get them at McDonald's or whether you get them at Wendy's, probably cost roughly the same and really have the same content, right? They're potatoes and fry grease and maybe some salt. And that's not always the case with fiber, right? Sometimes you have allergies to wools, or your budget doesn't allow you to perhaps buy the incredibly expensive yarn that a designer calls for. And that's why substitutions are important. I just wanted to note that it may not necessarily be the designer's responsibility to give you that information because they have that relationship with the yarn company. Okay. But that's what this video is all about, is empowering you to make the substitutions on your own. So now that we've covered the Yarn Ideas tab on Ravelry option, let's take a look at my second option that I think is really accessible to virtually any knitter out there. I really like to use Yarnsub.com, and I'll make sure there's a link in the description below. Yarnsub is short for Yarn Substitutions. It's a really cool website where you can input the information for the yarn that the designer calls for and get results of yarns that will be similar that you can use in your project. Let's say you want to knit a sweater and the original pattern calls for Shelter from Brooklyn Tweed. This is a woolen spun worsted weight yarn that isn't very hard to find, but it isn't super budget friendly, and it's 100% wool. You'll start by entering in the yarn the pattern calls for into the search box and then hit the search button. That's the little magnifying glass icon. Before any alternatives are listed on the page, you'll be shown a filter box. If you leave everything checked, you'll be provided with yarns that are the closest to the Brooklyn Tweed available. It won't filter price or fiber content automatically. If fiber content isn't a concern and you want a yarn that is very close to what you would get with the Brooklyn Tweed, but you want it to be more budget conscious, leave everything in the left-hand column checked and reduce the price check marks on the right side of the screen. If the fiber content is the issue and the budget is less of a restriction, you can adjust what you need in the left-hand column and turn the right-hand column back on to the $ amount that feels appropriate. So in this case, we'll get rid of any wool fibers and leave any animal-derived fibers like silk, synthetic fibers, and plant fibers all checked off. Then you start to see yarns that are perhaps more in the price range of Brooklyn Tweed but have a much different fiber content. So the Yarnsub.com website won't always give you a place to purchase the yarns. Sometimes you'll see a link to the website for that yarn, but you won't see prices of yarn or where to buy it, like from a local yarn shop. So if you go to Google, that's always a great way to find it. And if you are a Ravelry user, you can go back to Ravelry and plug that name of the yarn into the yarn section on Ravelry, and you'll usually be given purchasing options. But realistically, Google is probably going to be your best option for sourcing the yarn if you find it on Yarnsub.com. So my third option is probably less definitive in terms of this is your answer, like you would find in the Yarn Ideas tab or on Yarnsub.com, but it takes a little bit closer look at the technical specs of yarn. So let's take a quick look at that. The Craft Yarn Council, which I will also link below, has amalgamated all the information about yarn weights in one place. Before you use this chart, it's important to note that there are a lot of variables that can impact the information that you see presented in this chart, but these are some good averages. If we look at the column below the skein that has the number 4 in it, this is for a worsted weight yarn. A worsted weight yarn is a very common weight of yarn, and on average you will use roughly a US 8 or 5mm needle to achieve a gauge of roughly 18 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. However, based on different variables in a yarn, such as the number of plies, how much the fiber content blooms when it's blocked, etc., the range of yarn that is considered worsted weight can go from 16 stitches all the way down to 20 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So let's look at kind of a real world example. I'm obviously going to be pulling from the stash on my shelves, but let's pretend we're standing in a yarn shop and we've got some of the yarn that the designer calls for our pattern. Let's say perhaps that the fiber content is exactly what we want, but the budget or the price of the yarn isn't really within our budget, so we need to look for a substitute. Let's take a look at the information on the original skein and compare it to an alternative yarn that is of the same weight but is a bit more budget conscious, just to see if they're a good substitute or not. So for the purposes of this example, I'm going to be using yards per grams, which I realize is kind of a mix between two different measurement systems, but it is a fairly common way that we do it. So we're going to look and see that this skein of yarn is 196 yards per 100 grams, and its content is merino and yak, 85% merino, 15% yak. The ball band needle recommendation is a US 7 or a 4.5mm needle that will net you a gauge of approximately 26 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So a really quick note on the gauge on a ball band. I actually got an email about this a couple of weeks ago when I released my Oceansider sweater. When a yarn company creates the gauge recommendation on their ball band, they are measuring that over stockinette stitch, not garter stitch, not a lace stitch. So just keep in mind that if you're knitting something that is perhaps garter stitch or a really complicated lace stitch, the gauge that you see in the pattern may not directly relate to the gauge on the ball band, because that's going to be provided on a stockinette stitch gauge and likely worked flat, not in the round. So when you're looking for information on a ball band, it's good to look at the gauge, but I would say it's less indicative of whether it's going to be a good substitute as much as looking at fiber content and the yardage per grams. So this skein of woolly worsted, which you know is already one of my favorite brands of yarn, let's say that this is the alternative yarn that we're going to be considering. I'm going to be ignoring the gauge right off the bat and look more specifically at the fiber content and the yardage per grams. So I can see, well, I already know the yarn is a superwash 100% merino wool. So that means we're already pretty close to the original, which was 85% merino, 15% yak. But this yarn is in 50 grams, so we have to do a small amount of math. It's listed at 95 yards per 50 grams. Since the original gray yarn was per 100 grams, we're just going to multiply that 95 by 2, and we realize that we then have 190 yards per 100 grams compared to the 196 yards per 100 grams. Now, in the world of knitting, that is incredibly close. 6 yards over 100 grams does not make a yarn incompatible. As a matter of fact, I would say that this is going to be an excellent substitute for this gray yarn because they are so very, very close. When we add in the fact that the fiber content is also very similar, I mean, it's going to be an excellent combination or substitution. It's important to note that a superwashed yarn is going to be slightly heavier than a non-superwashed yarn. The process they put it through adds just a tiny bit of weight to the fibers. And yak, which was in this one but not in this one, is also a little bit lighter. So you'll get slightly more yards per gram than you do here. So all in all, these two make a perfect substitution for each other. And although I did mention that I very rarely use the gauge as confirmation of being a good substitute, it never hurts to check it. We did note that this one was 20 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters on a US 7 or 4 millimeter needle. When I look at the ball band recommendation on the yarn that I want to substitute, the gauge is 20 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters on a US 8 needle. So the fact that they both have the same recommended gauge, even though the needle size changes a little bit, really confirms that this is going to be an excellent substitution. So as I mentioned just a couple of moments ago, different fiber contents weigh differently. Let's take a look at this black yarn, which I love, which we've already determined is 190 yards per 100 grams. This is a Let's start again. This is a worsted spun, worsted weight yarn. If we compare it to something like Brooklyn Tweed Shelter, you're going to get a lot of different information. Although this is also a 100% wool product, it is not superwashed, which means it's going to be a little bit lighter. However, it's also woolen spun, which means that air gets trapped between the fibers, making it lighter, also warmer, but it's not as compacted or dense as a worsted spun yarn. So when you look at a ball band of woolen spun yarn, even though it's also worsted weight, you're going to get a lot more yardage. This is 140 yards per 50 grams or 280 yards per 100 grams compared to the 190 yards per 100 grams. So not all worsted weight yarns are created equal. It's really important to get an understanding of what different plies, what different spins, worsted versus woolen, and different fiber contents can do in terms of changing the weight of a yarn with like the weight physically, how much it weighs per gram versus the weight of the yarn. These are both worsted weight. Boy, that word weight carries a lot of weight with it, doesn't it? So with all of this information, it's important to note that understanding weights of fiber in terms of how much they weigh per gram, per yard, is not something that you can expect to know without time and practice. So there are a couple of things that you can do that I have done, or you can see what other resources you can find online. One of the things that I really like is the Fleece and Fiber source book. Now, this book is largely used by spinners who create their own yarn from raw fleece or clean fleece, just from fleece in general. But if you are a book lover, it is a wonderful resource for learning more about different fibers. Not only do you get a sense of whether they're bouncy or kind of flat or shiny or have a natural halo, you get to learn more about the sheep, how they were bred, where they're from. I just find it a really excellent resource, and I will be sure to link that in the description below. It's not an affiliate program. I'm not getting paid for referring that. It's just a really wonderful book that I love. The other option that you have, and I've only been to one yarn store where this was an option to me, but it doesn't hurt if you have an LYS that you can speak to someone to see if they offer it. Basically, when a yarn store creates shop samples, they may have leftover yarns available. So you can purchase, if they're open to it, small parts of a skein of yarn that maybe you want to learn more about the fibers or how it's going to work in your hands, and see if they're willing to sell you a partial skein. As I said, not every shop is going to offer that, but it's not a bad option to ask. And one last option to get your hands on some fibers that you perhaps haven't tried yet is asking your community. If you have friends who are knitters or have a knitting group nearby, see if there are folks in the group who are maybe willing to trade partial skeins with you. Maybe you've got your hands on a skein of yarn that you've got like half left over from a project that someone in a knitting group might want to try. It might be worth seeing if there are people who are willing to trade partial skeins with you to learn what those fibers do. Of course, if budget is not a concern, maybe there's a particular yarn that you're really anxious to try, you can always order a single skein, knit up a hat, or even just a swatch, just to see what the fibers do before you jump into a huge project like a sweater, just to make sure you're going to love it. Okay, folks, that's where we're going to leave it for today. I feel like I've done a lot of talking and said the word wait several times. If you have specific questions about yarn substitutions that were not covered in today's episode, please feel free to leave a comment below and I'll be happy to answer that question for you. Next week, we are finally going to be talking about something that you guys have asked for months now. We're going to be talking about bust darts and shaping in a sweater to get the best fit. I finally decided how I want to tackle this, so next week we're going to be talking about it. So definitely come back and join me. If you enjoyed today's episode, remember to give this video a like, and if you haven't already, remember to hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and happy knitting.